Hi everyone and welcome back. Just as a quick review, we have covered the five elements in the Elements and Principles of Design. We've talked about line, we've talked about shape and form, we've talked about space, we've talked about color, and we've talked about texture. So those are the five elements of design. Now we're going to move on to the six principles. There are six of them. And we're going to be starting with emphasis today. Now, emphasis is used by artists. They use opposing shapes, opposing colors, opposing sizes in order to place emphasis on a certain area of their photograph or on a certain subject. Then the eye is directed to what we call that focal point. The focal point is the part of a work of art that first draws your viewer's eye. Okay? So again, we use contrasting shapes, sizes, and colors to create that emphasis, to create a point of interest that draws our eye as a viewer. So if you'll notice in the first photograph, we're using contrasting colors there, right? We have the whole composition, the whole photograph is green, but then we have that pop of red, right? So we're contrasting the red against the green, and so our eyes are drawn whoop to that one little piece of red in the photograph, to that blooming flower. The same thing on the bottom. Again, we're using contrasting colors there. We have all of those brown eggs and then one white egg. And so naturally, our eye is drawn to that focal point, is drawn to that point of interest because it stands out from all the rest, okay? Now, in both of these examples, you'll see that we used color, contrasting colors, but you don't have to use color. You can do contrasting textures, right? You can do smooth versus rough. You can do contrasting shapes. You can do contrasting sizes, something large next to something small in order to create emphasis. But the goal is always using contrast, using something in opposition to something else in order to create a focal point that the viewer's eye is drawn to. The next principle of design that we're going to be talking about today is movement. And movement refers to the arrangement of parts or pieces in your photograph that creates movement, right? Or it's the arrangement of parts in order to create movement in your photograph. We often see movement manifested in photographs as blur, okay? So you'll see here that the ride, whatever this is, Ferris wheel of some kind, we know that it's moving because of the blur that we see in the photograph. We know that it's spinning because you have this like circular blur. And so our eyes immediately, our eyes see it and our brains go, oh, that's movement. Something's moving. You can have like a moving car, often blurred. You can have someone riding a bike, often blurred. Birds taking off into the air. So while there's not actual movement, the blur that the subject creates suggests movement to our brain, and then we compute that, okay? The next principle that we're talking about is number 8 on our list of 11, and it's called balance. Now, this balance is totally different. Well, not totally different, but different than the balance that we talked about in composition, okay? So this type of balance, we're going to talk about two types, okay? First, we have informal or asymmetrical balance, and then the second is formal or symmetrical balance. With informal asymmetrical balance, we have unlike objects, right? Or even like objects, but things that don't look exactly the same on both sides of our composition, okay? Let me show you an example. So in this photograph on the left-hand side, right? If we draw a line down the photo, right? We call this like the axis of our photograph. We're to draw a line straight down the center of this photograph. You'll notice that there's balance of the elements on both sides. On one side you have the lantern, and on the other side you have those bells. So even though they're not the exact same thing, they still take up the same amount of space in that photograph, right? They kind of have the same, we like to say, weight. They have the same amount of weight in the photograph. They're both taking up essentially the same amount of space. So even though they're two entirely different things, we say that this photo is an example of asymmetrical balance because the elements are balanced on both sides of the axis. So then you may have guessed our next type of balance is similar, but a little different. And that is formal or symmetrical balance. And that's when objects on both sides of that axis or that imaginary line that we draw down the center of a photograph, and you can draw it either vertically or horizontally, but elements on either side of that imaginary line are exactly the same. They are what we call mirror images of each other. So if we go back to our photographs, you'll see both of these have vertical points of axis too, right? So if you were to draw an imaginary line straight down the middle, that photo is a perfect mirror image. You could literally fold that photo in half and the elements would line up perfectly on both sides. That is symmetrical balance. We see the same thing in the other photograph next to it. We draw a line straight down the center. We draw an imaginary line straight down the center, and the elements on both sides of that line are almost exactly alike. Okay, now there's one little window that's off, but still, for the most part, this photograph is an example of symmetrical balance. Okay. The next principle that we are going to talk about today is unity. And let me tell you, this principle is the one that my students always have the hardest time understanding. Typically, when I do this, when we learn about the elements and principles of design in class, I have you all get into groups and create PowerPoints. You all get your own element or principle, and then you create a presentation and you teach each other. It's kind of hard right now with us being apart, and so I'm giving just the lecture for all of them. But I say all of that because the group that gets unity every year, no matter what period, whatever group gets unity, inevitably they're confused because unity sounds really confusing when you first read about it. Okay, so let's read it. It says unity occurs when all the elements work together to make a well-balanced whole. In other words, the individual elements work together to support the overall theme of the work. Unity is another of those hard to describe art terms, but when it's present, your eye and brain are pleased to see it. Miss Russell, what the heck does that mean? Let me put it in the simplest form ever, okay? Unity is when all of the stuff in your photograph goes together, okay? So all of those words kind of make it more confusing than it is. Unity is when all the stuff in your photograph goes together. So let's look at this example. We have a beach scene, right? We have the sand, we have the water, we have waves, we have beach chairs, we have an umbrella. If we had a palm tree over on the side of this, that would work well too. All of those elements go together with the overall theme, right? The theme being like a beach scene, okay? All of those elements work together. Now, if we were to see a robot just strolling down the beach, that would be the opposite of unity because your eye would see it and go, whoa, that doesn't belong. Right? With a photo that is representative of unity, your eye looks at it, your brain is pleased because everything goes together. Another example I like to give is of a playground scene, right? You have the swings, you have a merry-go-round, although they don't have those anymore because they're death traps, but they had them when I was a kid. Okay, you have swings, you have a slide, right? You have a structure that you can climb on. You have kids running around, laughing and all of that. So those all go together. That would be an example of unity. Now, if you throw a spaceship in there, your eye is going to be whoa, that doesn't fit. So in a photo that has unity, everything fits together. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit. Our next principle is pattern, and it's the shortest one, and in my opinion, the easiest to understand. You just repeat things, right? You repeat elements. So in here we have repeated forms or repeated shapes, kind of triangles or squares, diamonds, right? That are repeated over and over again. Or you can have the repeated texture. You can have a repeated color. All of those are elements, right? Texture, color, line, those are all elements. So pattern happens when you repeat elements over and over and over again. Okay? It's that simple. So in our photo example, we see the repetition of these tiles and it leaves behind a pattern. We're used to pattern. We see them in our everyday lives. We see them on the clothes that we wear. We see them just all over the place. Okay, so patterns should be easy for you to find and easy for you to photograph. The last principle that we are going to be talking about today is contrast. And now contrast goes hand in hand with emphasis, right? Because we typically use contrast to create emphasis. But if we were back on that emphasis slide and you were wondering, because I kept saying, use contrast, use contrast. If you were wondering what contrast is, you've come to the right place, okay? So contrast is basically, in its simplest term, differences, right? Differences in values, differences in the lightness or darkness of a photograph, differences in colors, differences in textures, differences in sizes, okay? So we put two things that are different next to each other to create excitement in our photograph. So that's what contrast does. It creates visual interest and it creates excitement. Okay, so in this photograph, just a super simple example of contrast. We have a very dark, almost black background, and then the pop of the really bright bird in the foreground creates that contrast, creates visual emphasis, or creates visual interest. And in turn, it creates emphasis here, right? We use contrast often to create emphasis. And so our eyes are drawn, whoop, to a focal point, which is the bird right in the center. Our eyes are drawn to that focal point because of the contrast of the light against the dark. Okay? So we kind of sped through our lecture today. The principles, I think, are a lot easier than the elements, or at least there's less to them. So we got through it pretty quickly. I would recommend now going back, looking at your notes, maybe reviewing the lectures. I will put this PowerPoint up on Schoology. I will post it to our quarter 2, week 4 folder so that you can access it again if you need to review it. Because at the end of this lecture, you are asked to go take the Kahoot quiz. You all did super well on your last quiz with where were we? Composition. Everyone did super well on that one for the most part. So again, you can go review your notes. You can use your notes on your quiz. But if you have any questions, as always, please email me. And until next time, bye everybody.